Thank you, Dan. I'm Julie Pace. I am the executive editor of the Associated Press. Very happy to be with you all tonight. I want to thank the Transatlantic Leadership Network for hosting this very important event, to the National Press Club for hosting us here this evening. Both organizations really play such a vital role in promoting press freedoms around the world and helping to protect our rights as journalists to do very basic things, to hold powerful people accountable, and to also give a voice to communities who otherwise would not have a voice. I also want to extend my congratulations to the award winners tonight. I have great admiration for all of you and the roles that you play in protecting our press freedoms and the role of an independent press. Now, these very basic rights of journalists, they're something I've been thinking about quite a bit since I've assumed my new role as executive editor of the AP. Our news department at AP has 250 locations around the world in 100 countries. And I think that that global footprint is more important than ever before, even at a moment when we have technology that allows anyone to become a citizen journalist, to tweet information, to post photos, to post video. That content, of course, is a tremendous asset. It has given more people an ability to tell their own stories. But I think there remains deep power in the on-the-ground expertise of our journalists and other news organizations like ours. I think often about the specific things that the world wouldn't see without the on-the-ground presence of AP journalists and other independent journalists. For example, the world wouldn't have known about the conditions of slaves in Southeast Asia who were held captive by the global and powerful seafood industry. The world wouldn't see the independent imagery that our photojournalists and our video journalists are able to transmit from North Korea, one of the most restrictive countries in the world. And the world wouldn't know the depths of the atrocities that are happening right now in Ethiopia, in the Tigray region, where a civil war has been raging for more than a year and the threat of famine looms. But increasingly, the Associated Press and other independent organizations are facing severe restrictions on our ability to be on the ground, to simply bear witness to what is happening. In Ethiopia, for example, the government has enacted recently new orders that restrict the sharing of non-official information about military-related movements, essentially limiting coverage of the civil war to the government's official version of events. Now, this is, of course, not a new playbook. Authoritarian regimes have long tried to block independent reporting and intimidate journalists as part of their quest to remain in power. But the trend lines that we are seeing globally right now are particularly troubling. Countries that had been moving forward in terms of press access are taking steps backward. And even in the United States and in other traditionally democratic nations, we see democratically elected leaders who are attacking the media, seeking to undermine our credibility for their own personal gain. And I do, of course, include leaders in the United States and European nations. The consequences of that are dangerous. We see it play out in real time. Not far from where we are all gathered here today, my colleague John Manchillo, a prize-winning AP photographer, was beaten by members of the mob that attacked the US Capitol. Other AP journalists who were covering the insurrection had their video gear set on fire and destroyed. Now, I'm grateful that in the United States, there remain legal protections for journalists, and we've seen prosecutions for some of those who have attacked our team and others. It's vital that we, as the people in this room, make clear, not just through our words in these forums, but for our advocacy for those legal protections, that they must remain in place. Because we see all too often in other countries examples where journalists are beaten or killed without repercussions, where they are jailed or kicked out of their countries. I just flew back earlier today from meeting with our team in Latin America, and one of the situations that we were discussing there was our increasing worry about our ability to report in Nicaragua, the latest in a growing list of countries where journalists who are there on the ground, bearing witness, are having to take steps to protect their own identity, to take their bylines off of stories, off of their photo captions. And increasingly, we find ourselves as news organizations who are trying to report on these countries, places like Nicaragua, like Belarus, like Myanmar, having to do so from outside of their borders, relying on brave sources who continue to want to share information with us. And I do want to take a moment to recognize those sources because they are so essential to what we are trying to do when our physical access to report on the ground in countries is restricted. These sources are oftentimes very well aware of the risks that they face in talking to us, yet they do so anyways because they believe deeply in sharing the stories of what is happening in their home countries. We couldn't do our jobs without them, and we are grateful for their commitments. Just this week, we had to rely on anonymous sources to help us report a major story out of Myanmar, where Aung San Suu Kyi, the country's civilian leader, was convicted by a court and sentenced to 4 years in prison. Suu Kyi, of course, was ousted earlier this year by the military, and reporting on what is happening inside Myanmar right now since the military takeover is what I would consider one of the most difficult journalism challenges in the world at this moment. Journalists can and have been detained arbitrarily, including my colleague, AP's Tain Zaw, who was detained while on assignment earlier this year covering a protest on the streets in the middle of the day. It took an enormous public pressure campaign as well as very sensitive behind-the-scenes diplomatic and legal efforts to have Tain Zaw released after 3 weeks. But scores of Burmese journalists remain detained or missing. Others have fled the country. And quite simply, it is unsafe for anyone in Myanmar right now to be conspicuously practicing the act of journalism. Which leads us to this week, and this major, but in some ways very basic story that was unfolding literally behind closed doors. Reporters were banned from the courtroom where Suu Kyi was appearing and couldn't even get near the venue. The lawyers involved in the case were subject to a gag order and couldn't talk to the press. Fortunately, we and some other news organizations had trusted court sources who were willing to talk with us anonymously, allowing us to get news out to the world that Suu Kyi had been sentenced. This was hours before the government ever said anything about it. Now, I raise this example for 2 reasons. First, it does show just how difficult even that basic reporting out of Myanmar is right now, let alone coverage of what is happening in more far-flung parts of Myanmar or to minority communities in the country, or really any average citizen who is trying to challenge the military rule there. But 2, and I think this is vitally important, it shows that we and other news organizations are continuing to find ways to report the news, to push past the barriers that authoritarian regimes put in place to try to maintain their grip on power. And that is our challenge for everyone in this room, whether we are journalists, whether we are public officials, whether we are working for nonpartisan organizations, NGOs, is to continue to help put journalists in position to push past those barriers. It is one of the challenges, I think, of our time right now, is one of the deep passions of my career, and I hope that you will all join me in that effort. Thank you.